The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Is music an art, a science, or medicine? Neuroscientist and musician Daniel Levitin is with us on why it's all three. Also, we'll get perspectives from the Association of Municipalities of Ontario conference on how to deliver on housing targets. That's next on the agenda. We've had a lot of neuroscientists on this program over the years, but I dare say we've had only one who regularly hangs out with the likes of Joni Mitchell, Sting, Paul Simon, Stevie Wonder, and Bobby McFerrin, and can play the sax, guitar, and bass. Daniel Levitin is fascinated by the effect of music on the brain, and he has written another book exploring that connection. It's called I Heard There Was a Secret Chord, and it brings Daniel Levitin back to our studio tonight. It's great to see you again.
It's great to be back.
I don't know how many appearances this is for you on our program, probably 4 or 5, something like that. Every time you come out with a new book, we'd like to have you in. Before I start with the book, you're from California and you're wearing a Canadian flag on your lapel, and I got to find out why that is.
I had been at McGill for a few years, and when Michaëlle Jean was Governor General, she came to visit. Heather Monroe Bloom was principal and brought her to my lab. And Governor General Jean said, "Are you a citizen?" And I said, "No." She said, "How long have you been here?" I said, 4 years. She said, "You have to become a citizen." And so I did. I applied for citizenship, and she came to the ceremony and gave me this pin.
Come on. That's pretty special.
It's a pretty special pin. I'm told it's not the regular pin. It means a lot to me to be Canadian. My grandfather was born in Toronto. I made my career at McGill, and it's very important to me.
Marvelous. All right, let's do an excerpt from your book as we start to think about the secret chord that you were referring to. Sheldon, if you would, bring the graphic up. We may think of science and art as standing in opposition to one another, but they are bound by a common objective. Science seeks to find truth in the natural world. Art seeks to find truth in the emotional world. Medicine fits somewhere in between, bridging science, art, and the emotions that move us toward the will to survive, to heal, to take our medicine, to exercise, and to put in motion all those things that keep us healthy.
It really sounds better when you read it.
Let's start with music. Is it a science? Is it an art? Is it medicine? Where is it on that continuum?
I think it's all of them. Why does it have to be just one?
Doesn't?
Going back to Pythagoras, of course, there's the science of how the overtone series works. Certainly, musicologists take a scientific approach to understanding how music is composed and performed. Empirical musicologists and music neuroscientists like myself take a scientific approach to understanding how it creates the effects it does emotionally and cognitively. And certainly, it's unequivocally an art. And it's an interesting art form. It's the only art form that causes your body to move. You don't look at a painting and want to twitch and dance and,
But you do with music.
Yeah.
You do. All right, let's pursue this notion of music and the effect it has on the brain. And you refer to this in your book where somebody sings Happy Birthday at a party, someone starts it, they set the key, everybody else pretty much joins in, and they join in key. How does that happen?
Isn't that fascinating?
It is.
And there's no reason that it should. The Gestalt psychologists back in 1890 posed this problem. A song, they said, is an auditory object composed of pitches, but you can change every single pitch and it's still the same song. How does that happen? Well, the brain has giant pattern detectors. If nothing else, that's what the brain is. It is itself a giant pattern detector. And so it seeks to find order in the world. If you've ever laid on your back on a sunny day and looked at the clouds and you've seen bunny rabbits and things, it's your brain imposing some sort of order on what is a disordered world. So we see the pattern of pitches, we create a mental representation of the melody, and then that is shiftable in pitch space and in temporal space. I can drag it out. Happy birthday, doing really slow, and you still recognize it.
You sounded like Marilyn Monroe to JFK there for a second. Well, a little bit, a little bit.
Mr. President.
Yeah. How is it possible that some very musical people can hear music, they dance perfectly to the beat, they know the songs, when they sing them, every note sounds the same?
Yeah, so there's been a lot written about this, and I dubbed this back in the 90s a kind of tune deafness. It's not tone deafness because they can hear the difference between the tones, but they're tune deaf, particularly when they're singing. So one possibility is that they just lack precise control over the vocal folds, that they just never learned how to match a pitch they hear in their head with their muscle. And, you know, it's like learning to bat when you're a kid, right? You don't always hit the ball. You've got to learn how to coordinate your movements. Another possibility, not mutually exclusive, is that they have what we call a self-monitoring deficit, which is that they don't realize they're not singing the pitches.
Interesting. Okay. Again, I know this from the book.
You said interesting, but it sounds like you weren't really interested. Sounds like you were moving on.
No, on the contrary. Well, I can find it both interesting and yet need to move on at the same time. This is the nature of an interview.
Yeah, thank you.
When I read about your wife, Heather, I thought, okay, she and I have something in common here, because I'd be really good at that game, Name That Tune. You remember that? Where
Yeah.
I know a song after 2 or 3 notes.
Da, da, da.
Star Spangled Banner.
I was thinking All of Me, but...
Oh, that too?
Yeah.
Okay, works both ways. But lyrics. I am having a devil of a time remembering the lyrics to songs that I knew the lyrics of completely back in the day. How can I be so good at one aspect of memory but not at the other?
Yeah, and my wife Heather doesn't know any lyrics at all. She just hears the melody. And she can do that, Name That Tune in 3 notes just from the melody. You know, different people have different foci, different things about music that grab them. It can be rhythm, it can be the timbre, the sound of Johnny Cash's voice is just, you know, what you tune into. It can be the lyrics. And then I think what you're describing is a declining over time
Yes.
cognizance or memory for the lyrics.
Not for the tune, though. The tune's there,
Yeah.
but the words.
So from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, the tune is a highly structured medium. There are only 12 notes, and Carol Krumhansel and others have shown that even the average non-musician listener has a very highly sophisticated, basically statistical detector that knows which notes are likely to follow which. And so that gives you a leg up because there are these probabilities about what notes follow which. And then every once in a while, the composer surprises you and throws in a note that you didn't expect, and that's memorable because it's surprising. Lyrics are less constrained, they're less structured. And so that's probably one of the reasons that they slip out.
I feel embarrassed that you went bum, 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 and I didn't think of Sinatra and All of Me.
Well,
But it's because you're from the States, and so I immediately thought of the Star Spangled Banner. Ella Fitzgerald's Mac the Knife. This is a great story.
Yeah.
She forgot the words, and it ended up being utterly memorable. What happened?
This is one of the most extraordinary things, and what cognitive neuroscientists like myself like to do is find failures of human cognition, because it's a window into how the whole thing works. Usually when something breaks, you get a glimpse into the underlying mechanisms. So my colleague Danny Kahneman, for example, I worked in his lab when I was a student. He spent his career studying the foibles of decision-making by studying how people make bad decisions. Here we've got a wonderful insight into memory by somebody who lost hers temporarily. Ella is singing Mac the Knife at Berlin in front of a live audience. She's at the peak of her career. And she forgets the words, but what does she remember? She remembers the melody, she remembers the rhythm, the beat, the accents. She's swinging along with the song, and she even remembers the rhyme scheme. So as she starts improvising lyrics, she maintains the meter and the rhyme scheme. It's extraordinary. And it became so well known because of I guess, just the sheer imaginativeness and brilliance of her being able to ensure that the show must go on. She doesn't stop and ask somebody for the lyrics. She knows her job is to entertain, and boy, does she.
How she did that, like, we'll never know, right? Well, you'll know because you know what's going on in the brain. Let's add another wrinkle to our conversation here. Music, the brain, and disease. How is it possible that a profoundly disabled person who cannot pick up a piece of food with a fork and get it to his mouth can sit behind a piano and sound like Oscar Peterson? How does that happen?
Well, so we studied this with Williams syndrome. This is one of the first things I studied in my career. Profoundly developmentally disabled people with bad motor control, but somehow musical circuits exist separately from other circuits in the brain. This leads us to believe, contrary to what Steven Pinker has said, that music is simply auditory cheesecake and an evolutionary accident. It leads us to believe that music ability was an adaptation, an important part of our heritage genetically. And this is what allows music to be medicine in the case of Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis. It's what allows musicians to overcome stuttering when they sing, even though they stutter when they speak, such as Elvis Presley.
Mel Tillis,
Kendrick Lamar. So the music circuits act as a secondary way of expressing oneself, and they co-opt the brain and overtake the damaged circuits.
Bobby McFerrin, don't worry, be happy. He's got Parkinson's.
He does.
He's still performing. What does that do for him?
You know, I've known Bobby for a long time. He's visited the lab at McGill. We've performed together, and I knew when I was writing this book that I wanted to talk to him because his music has been healing for so many, including me. And I was devastated to learn when I called him that he had just been diagnosed with Parkinson's. He was very depressed when he learned it. One of the things that led to the diagnosis was that he couldn't do things with his voice that he wanted to do, that he had always been able to do.
And his voice is a percussion instrument, right? In a way that others is not.
It's an everything instrument.
Yeah.
It's an amazing instrument. And he didn't start singing till he was 20. So, you know, according to Carlos, maybe he sings with an accent.
Right.
But what it does for him is it sets the disease aside. He performs not so much for the audience anymore, but for himself. It's very difficult for him to get up in the morning and he does shows now at noon because the evenings are bad time for him. He sings from noon to 1:30 at the Freight and Salvage in Berkeley. And I know it sounds extravagant, but anybody here in our listening audience who can get there, it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. No two concerts are the same. It's all pure improvisation. Audience members can join him on stage. And what it does for him is, although it's hard to get there, once he starts singing, he comes alive. Certain sequences of neurochemicals are released. Dopamine, a motivating chemical. Serotonin, which boosts his mood. Cortisol decreases, the stress hormone, which would otherwise make it hard for him to function because of the stress of knowing that he's going to die of this disease. All of that lasts for days after he sings, and it's a wonderful self-medication.
Having said that, Linda Ronstadt has Parkinson's. She doesn't sing anymore, and apparently the music is not helpful to her. How come?
Linda and I talked about this. She lost so much. Parkinson's manifests differently in every person. And Linda, years ago, lost the control over her voice that she needed to have to do what she does. And it's tragic for her. It's tragic for us. But she's a very engaged, bright, intelligent person who reads a lot. She has a full life, but yeah, not involving music.
Joni Mitchell. You know Joni very well. You visited her place frequently after she had her stroke in hopes of helping to bring something back. What did you two do?
Well, it goes back to the early 2000s when Joni was asked to make for a Starbucks record label, if you remember that, a Desert Island disc. What are her favorite songs that she would want? And she had me over to her home. We spent many late nights spinning her records, going through her CDs, and just having the greatest time listening to music we both loved. And then, I was a fly on the wall as she kind of said, well, maybe I'll put this on the CD, maybe this. And Dan, do you think it would be weird if I put on 2 songs by Deep Forest? Can I do 2 of one artist? And can I put on one of my own? And we had a great time. And so years later, when she is home recovering from her aneurysm stroke and can't yet speak, I suggested to the nurses, play that Desert Island Disc. We know by definition that is her favorite music. And she really had previously not responded to much going on in the environment, being so disoriented. But when those songs came on, Steve, it allowed her to reconnect with a self she had lost, to find herself, her core again. And then after listening to that for a couple of weeks, I suggested that they dig deep. There's Edith Piaf on there. Play a whole Edith Piaf album. This is where it is in her living room. It's on this part of the shelf. I remember. Play Steely Dan. She loves Steely Dan. This is where you'll find that. And they did. And I wouldn't go so far as to speculate that music was the reason for her extraordinary recovery, but it was certainly the catalyst, coupled with an indomitable will, an intensely driven personality that she was going to beat this.
Does it make sense to you that music can have that much impact on somebody's recuperative powers?
It certainly makes sense for somebody who's a musician and whose life is music. And I would say musician includes a lot of us, people who are not necessarily performers or writers. If you are moved by music, I would say you have great musicality and you can call yourself a musician. My former student, Susan Rogers, who was Prince's recording engineer, doesn't play an instrument, but when Miles Davis came in to collaborate with Prince, he said to Susan, you are one of the greatest musicians I ever met.
That's all right.
And she doesn't play an instrument.
This is a very weird stat, or maybe not. You tell me. The 7 in 10 British musicians who suffer from panic attacks or depression suffers it at a rate 3 times that of the general population. Why?
Being a professional, we don't really know, but being a professional musician carries with it a lot of hazards that being a good amateur musician don't. Trying to make your living as a musician, being subject to scrutiny in front of a crowd, wondering if you still have the respect of your peers. Have I sold out? Am I still relevant? Ensuring that you are somehow being true to your artistic self and also pleasing your public, your audience. That's a very stressful job.
Is there anything of classical music that can make you cry?
Absolutely. Mahler's Second by Tilson Thomas makes me cry with awe. Because it's a piece I never understood until I heard him conduct it live with Edwin Outwater conducting the backstage supplementary orchestra.
Is Michael Tilson Thomas?
Yeah.
Where'd you see him do it?
San Francisco.
Okay.
Certainly Beethoven's Seventh. And part of that is because I played it in school and I feel a more intimate connection to it. But yeah, and anything by Debussy.
Okay. Some of us are into Frank Sinatra. Others among us are into alternative garage grunge. Is there something different about our brains that accounts for that?
No. Well, yes. Well, no.
Which is it?
Our brains are literally wiring themselves up to the music we hear in the womb because we hear through the amniotic fluid. You might say it's a womb with a view.
You're here through Thursday, try the veal.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
But no, from the first 50 years of life, we're creating massively creating new neural pathways, wiring ourselves up to the experience of the world. That music gets in there, and it shapes the music we will want to hear the rest of our lives. We all have a sort of adventuresomeness dial. Some of us want to expand out of that. Some of us want to hew very closely to it. But some people like heavy metal, some people like country, some people like classical. And there are distinct brain activations going on with the different genres. Certainly hip-hop activates the more rhythmic centers in the cerebellum, classical, the more tonal centers in the frontal lobe. But when you look at the emotional centers in the limbic system, activation is virtually identical regardless of the genre, if it's music you like and you're responding to emotionally. And that is the reason, that's the core reason why music has medicinal value. It's that any kind of music that works for you can boost your immune system, it can boost your mood, it can help T cells and NK cells travel to the site of an infection because of that emotional impact it has on you, not because of the notes or the rhythms per se.
We got a couple of minutes left here. I want to do one serious question and I want to do one not so serious question. At the end of the book, you reference Northrop Frye, who's a big deal in this country, and composer Kent Nagano or Nagano? How does he say it? Nagano. Okay.
Conductor Kent Nagano.
Conductor.
Montreal Symphony, yeah.
To hammer home the point that the arts are a fundamental part of being human. And we know that when school boards run into trouble, one of the first things they cut if they need to find money is the music program. What do you think we lose if society loses music and the arts?
Well, I mean, I'm just a simple country neuroscientist. This isn't really my domain. But, you know, Northrop Frye and Kent Nagano and others who have thought deeply about this would say, without the arts, we cannot connect to people whose thoughts and experiences are different from our own. We reject them intellectually. But the arts can open our hearts, and when that happens, the mind follows. Without the arts, we cannot engage in acts of imagining a world different than the one we're in, and if we can't imagine a better world, we can't create it.
That's pretty sweet. Do you want to end with the Calvin Coolidge joke?
Which is?
I'm not going to tell it. It was in here.
Yeah, so Calvin Coolidge was touring a farm with his wife.
Former president.
Yeah, in the United States, president of the United States. And his wife is out looking at the chickens and he's out looking at the sheep, and she sees that there's this rooster in this cage of hens, and she asks the guide, she says, that rooster seems pretty busy. And the guide says, yes. She says, you only need one rooster for these 200 hens? Oh yes, he can go at it all day long. And she said, would you tell that to Mr. Coolidge? So they send an aide over to President Coolidge. You know, Mrs. Coolidge wants you to know there's a rooster in there and he's going at it all day long. And Coolidge says, same hen? No, sir, different hens. Tell that to Mrs. Coolidge.
I thought we had to end from the sublime to the ridiculous, so there we go.
I tell the story because it illustrates the idea that we are omnivores in terms of music, that you should not listen to the same song all the time. Same song? No, listen to different songs.
So I've got to change the station occasionally from Seriously Sinatra to something else.
I would say so.
You would urge it. Daniel, you've done it again. I heard there was a secret chord, music as medicine. This is your brain on music. We remember we had you here for that before. Keep it going. That's Daniel J. Levitin, in here from San Francisco, but he's also a Canadian citizen as well.
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Two and a half years ago, the Ontario government identified that we would need 1.5 million new homes over the next decade to meet demand. What has happened since? The answer is not enough. What will it take to solve Ontario's housing crisis? Let's ask. Mike Moffat, founding director of Place Centre at the Smart Prosperity Institute. Lisa Helps, the executive lead of BC Builds, a housing program delivered by BC Housing. Neil Rogers, strategic advisor for the Ontario Homebuilders Association, and Jag Sharma, deputy city manager of development and growth services for the City of Toronto. And could we please welcome them here to AMO this year, everybody? Thank you. I do have to say a little housekeeping off the top. First of all, Mike, you didn't come that far to join us, did you?
No, I walked here. You didn't have that one.
You walked here. Okay, yeah, you live in Ottawa. You two on the end there flew from Toronto, yes?
Yes.
I actually you are the winner. You flew from Victoria, British Columbia.
I did.
Okay, that's very impressive. Thank you for making such a
my
schlep to get
pleasure.
here to join us. You have, I should also say, the best name of anybody in politics I've ever seen. How'd you like to run for office and your name is Lisa Helps? Is that great? What was your slogan?
Well, it's interesting. We were chatting about this back room. So my team, when I ran for mayor, was at the whiteboard saying, "Okay, how about this? How about that?" And someone said, "It helps to vote," and then someone else said, "No, voting helps." And that's what my election sign
voting
said.
Helps.
Voting helps, because it actually drove voter turnout as well.
Excellent. Well done. Neil, you and I have to do a bit of a full disclosure thing here.
We do?
Who is your favorite Paikin?
Jeff.
Exactly. That would be my brother, who's a home builder in Southern Ontario, so we put that on the record in the interest of full disclosure. And away we go. Mike, a little background first. 1.5 million homes over the ensuing decade when they made the announcement. How did they come up with that number?
I actually don't know, to be quite honest. They released this number, and we did a report at Play Center, and we were actually trying to debunk it. At the time, we thought it was too high. So we looked at demographic change, population growth. We built this big Excel model, and it spat out 1.498 million. So our paper quickly changed from a debunking to a, yeah, that sounds about right. And the challenge is now that the population has continued to grow faster than the Ministry of Finance and others have forecasted. So we did a follow-up last summer and found it was about 1.7 million that we need instead. If I did one now, I think we're probably closer to 1.9 million. Now, we have to understand there's a lot of uncertainty about that. We don't know what's going to happen with things like international students, non-permanent residents, other temporary foreign workers, but it is an accurate figure. I think one caveat is we have to realize that a unit is not a unit is not a unit. We are building a lot of one-bedroom apartments in this province. Those are helpful, but what we're lacking is a lot of those larger family size units. So if we actually took the unit size into account, we might even need more than 2 million.
Lots to follow up on there, which we will. Jag, when you heard the number, 1.5 million, what was your reaction?
Well, there's one, it's a large number, and certainly from a Toronto perspective, there's two other numbers that we pay very close attention to, 285,000 for our 10-year goal, and of the 285,000, 65,000 affordable homes, and that was up from the original 40,000. They're large numbers, but to Mike's point, not enough. The challenge I think that we find ourselves in is that even at 65,000 units and 285,000, like just for the 65,000, we're estimating between $33 to $36 billion in order to accomplish that goal. It's a lot of money, and certainly capacity is somewhat a challenge as well. And so when we reflect on what Mike was saying, to say maybe it's closer to 2 million, and let's say those numbers need to be higher, the cost goes up as well. And this is an incredibly challenging time, but an incredibly important time for us to take as many actions as possible, because I think history is teaching us that indecision is costing us more.
Neil, when you heard the number, was your first reaction, ain't no way in hell we're going to be able to do that?
1.5 million homes is good for business. It's good for our economies, no matter where you are in the province of Ontario. But it is a consequential number. Even in our most robust years of housing production, we were meeting 50% of that. So to double that, you had to ask yourself the question, where do we find the skilled labor? How do we source the materials? How do we keep it affordable? So we applauded as an organization, as an association, the target. It represented years and years of undersupply of bringing production housing to the marketplace. We thought and think still it can be part of the equation of delivering housing affordability, but we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, Lisa, I don't want to unnecessarily embroil you in Ontario politics, given that you're not from here, but this province has never done better than 700,000 homes, and now they're going for 1.5 million. That's the target. As somebody who, well, politics, as Bill Davis used to say, is about the, you knew I'd get the reference in, is about the art of the possible. Is this even possible?
It has to be possible. I think in Ontario, in British Columbia, across the country, it has to be possible for us to come together, to rally, to build these homes, because otherwise, and not to start off on a really negative note, but otherwise our communities in our country are going to crumble. Our economy is going to crumble. Our neighborhoods are going to crumble. We're going to have more people living outside, on our streets, in our parks. So I see that there is no option for Ontario not to meet its target, for BC not to meet its target. We must, and I think the question, and I know we're going to dig into this here, the question is how? How can we? And I think we've got to put some things together differently than we've been doing in order to meet those targets.
From a political point of view, though, Mike, every time a minister has a press conference about housing, the issue of targets comes up, and the issue of you're not going to meet your target comes up.
Yeah.
Should the government set a quote-unquote more realistic target at this point?
No, just for the reasons that Lisa suggests, that I don't think failure is an option here. We're seeing, we had the report of over 200,000 persons experiencing homelessness here in Ontario, and we can quibble about whether or not that's too high or too low an estimate, but it seems reasonable to me. We're hearing 25 international students living in a 3-bedroom home in Brampton, and that's very common across the province. So unless something's happening on the population growth side, we have to house these people. There really isn't an option, so we've got to figure out how to get there.
Let me do a follow-up with you. How did we get into a position where we suddenly, a couple of years ago, realized, oh my goodness, we need an historic amount of housing built that we are not prepared to do? How did that happen?
Well, I think before the pandemic, there were a lot of reasons that people were giving about why home prices and rents were so expensive, and some of which had some merit to it. We said, okay, well, this is kind of an interest rate phenomenon, and when interest rates normalize, so will home prices. Well, they did, and they haven't. We've heard people talk about short-term rentals and all kinds of things, and those can play a role. But I think we weren't really paying attention to population growth. That in Ontario, historically, the population grows by about 120,000 people a year, and had so for about 20 years. After 2015, that ramped up substantially, and that was partly due to the oil price collapse in 2015. We had people moving from Ontario to Alberta. They started coming back. But the big thing that happened was that our colleges and universities started bringing in more and more international students because of deregulation from the federal government as a way to pay some of those bills. And what happens is those students need a place to live, but often stay after graduation, obtain a work permit and gain permanent residency. So when you go from consistently growing at about 120,000 people a year to overnight doubling and tripling that number, that's going to cause some tensions, and I think we weren't paying enough attention to that as a province or as a society.
Neil, I'm not advocating this, but I want you to consider the other side of the coin, which is to say, if we can't build enough to accommodate all of this demand, what about looking at the other side of the coin? Like, don't come to Ontario anymore. Or if you live in Ontario, why don't you think about moving to a different province? Is that an option?
No, not for Ontario. There have been, this government, the Ford administration has put a lot of money on the line, record investments in car manufacturing, EVs, the tech sector, the mining sector. We're at the point of no return. We can't say stop. People have made investments, people have made choices, municipalities are gearing up their systems and their staffing, so the solution is not just shift the problem to another province.
Jack,
although people are making decisions with their pocketbooks to go to other places, and that's regrettable. And maybe some smaller municipalities in Ontario will benefit from an ex-urban shift to small town rural communities, and that's great. But moving to another province, it's a consequential move, and unfortunately far too many individuals and families are having to do that because they simply can't afford it.
Jag, is that an option, do you think? I understand that it's a difficult political lift, but on the other hand, If you can't keep up with the demand, do you maybe have to try to reduce the supply of people coming here?
So I don't think it's a good strategy to reduce the number of people coming. I think it's, to what all of my peers here are saying, is we need to address more of the challenge. And one of the things that we politically is being very strongly stated from a Toronto perspective and otherwise is government has been absent in the building of affordable homes for many decades. And as a result, we're seeing this crisis of affordability and options for individuals. And I'm not just talking about individuals who need deeply affordable units, but I'm talking about professionals that are coming, whether they're planners or working within the police service or otherwise. They're struggling to find accommodations that are appropriate, that are close to where they work. And it's creating, a significant tension within the system. But what we can say from an evidence-based approach is that, for 30 years we've had a significant deficit of government being involved in building affordable homes. Now, that's not to disrespect our private sector partners. They very much value not only our partnership, but we have to walk hand in hand in getting this accomplished. But government needs to be much more active in the building of affordable homes.
What's your view on that, Lisa?
Well, I work for a Crown corporation called BC Housing, which builds homes that are affordable. And interesting, you mentioned the police service and planners. The government of BC earlier this year launched BC Builds, which is the program that I helped to deliver, which is exactly for that demographic of people: police officers, teachers, nurses, paramedics, transit operators. And so in BC, and again, there's always more to do, and we're not in much of a better circumstance than Ontario for sure. But since the NDP government took over in 2017, there's been a significant investment, billions and billions of dollars in affordable housing. And again, after decades of neglect, it takes a while to catch up. But what I can say from my perspective is that government investment, not only in deeply affordable housing, which is absolutely necessary, but the BC Builds program that I'm helping to deliver, we look for partnerships with municipalities to use public land. Are you building a new community center, a new library, a new fire hall, a new whatever? And BC Builds then comes in as a partner to say, okay, you build your infrastructure and let's put housing on top. So we're really maximizing the use of public land to deliver housing for the people who serve our communities, at the same time as other BC housing programs are working on that in that deeply affordable space. So yes, there needs to be massive government investment in housing, but we also need the private sector. Sometimes there's this either or, and that's really not helpful. That is not going to get us to 1.5 million in Ontario and 1 million in BC. It's all in together. It can't be public versus private.
Mike, can you pick up on that? Are the governments of Ontario and Canada as invested in building the housing we need today as they were, say, post-World War II?
No, I think we're getting there, and I couldn't agree more with Lisa. This has to be an conversation that we need. We need deeply affordable housing. We need government involved, but also the private sector. But I'd also say we need better planning, right? That we make international student decisions. Individual university and colleges make their decisions there in one silo. The immigration department up here makes another decision in a silo of what are we going to do to immigration targets. And then we have housing made in a completely different silo. And we need to integrate these things so we make sure that our housing supply is keeping up with our population growth, and we're making these decisions together, not making one first and then going, okay, well, how do we then affect the second policy to counteract our first one?
You're a planning guy. Is there enough good planning going on here?
I think there's great planning happening. Once again, though, the challenge is keeping up with decisions and the policy changes and all. So there's, from a density perspective, as a right perspective, there's a number of not only initiatives but policies being put in place to ensure that we can keep up as well as possible. So I'd say from a planning perspective, we are strong. It is better coordination that's going to be required, and I come back to the fact that, and it's not going to be cheap. We're going to need continued investment alignment and simplification, if we can, wherever we can, to whether it's stacking incentives or stacking programs, or aligning them from a funding perspective such that we don't have to make multiple applications, because it all takes resources, time, and money. And the more that we can simplify, we all have one objective, which is to deliver more homes, the right mix of homes, and if we can simplify as much as possible, it helps us get that much further.
Woodward and Bernstein used to say, follow the money. So let's follow the money here, shall we? Neil, the province passed a law to waive development charges in certain circumstances in order to spur on growth. Was that the right move?
Well, they actually repealed that in the last piece of legislation in Bill 185.
So we're not there anymore.
We're not there anymore. The elephant in the room remains affordability. If a nurse, if a teacher, those individuals who are not, by the way, making a lot of money, can't afford a home, we don't have a start. You don't have economic growth in your communities. And it's all levels of government. I'm not laying blame on the municipal sector here. Federal, provincial, municipal, 33% of the cost of an average home in the Greater Golden Horseshoe is taxes, fees, and charges. HST, land transfer tax, and the municipal realm of everything from permits, application fees, to development charges.
The feds took the HST off. Has that
only
helped?
on rental housing.
Only
on rental housing.
Has that helped?
And HST only applies to new home construction. It is not applicable to resale. $500,000 of that 1.3, give or take numbers here, that's like a couple of $1,000s just to service that mortgage for a lifetime. So we cannot have a conversation, in our respectful opinion, about housing supply if we don't start to have the conversation, and it will be a difficult and painful conversation, but we are in this together. Municipalities, provincial governments, municipal governments, the development industry, not-for-profits, you name it. The spectrum is long. I think we ought to have the conversation quickly, otherwise we will lose this opportunity to build, to meet 1.5, and the problem is only getting worse, as Michael mentioned.
If we had your side of the conversation, what would you be saying back to Neil when it comes to foregoing revenue for the city?
So I think we need to consider all options, and I think we need to work collaboratively. Neil and I were speaking earlier where I think we need to almost have an open book exercise and do the math, because what I know our development industry, our private sector partners are struggling as well, and we need both of us to be actively invested in these solutions and making sure that we are challenging each other to deliver to the best of our abilities. Municipalities are certainly going to continue to focus, and Toronto is going to continue to focus on affordable housing and making sure we're putting as much money to help kind of balance the supply that is so desperately needed for those who can't afford like a condo or something of that sort. But we also need our private sector partners to help us with challenging our assumptions, looking at the cost factors of what it is that we believe it's going to take, and challenging government to say, well, wait, that doesn't make sense, or we need to think about it differently in order to make it pencil better. Because it's a struggle. Affordable housing projects, our housing secretariat and development review team, they're having to rerun the numbers all the time, virtually on a weekly basis, because things are moving so quickly. And our private sector partners, we're having active discussions with them in the same way to say they can't make them their projects pencil. And that's a bad scenario for all of us, because we need not only the affordable housing, but we need the private sector development as well in order to keep industry going.
You want to come back on that, Neil?
Yeah, and for the record, I want to be clear to this group. I'm not talking about waiving development charges or not paying development charges. I think we need a more modern look at how the construct of municipal service delivery of critical infrastructure is paid for and financed. I cannot believe there are not solutions out there if we bring the right people to the table, whether that's through broadening municipal service utility corporations or municipal service corporations, whether that's allowing, we have some of the wealthiest pension funds in the world in Ontario, OMERS, teachers, HOOP, right? Are they allowed to participate in this conversation? They must. They must. So what I'm suggesting, I think what our association is also suggesting, is we need to have a modern conversation about housing supportive infrastructure, roads, bridges, community centers, et cetera. And it all falls under the veil of development charges. And I know there's always been some friction between the sector and municipalities on that. But I think if we come together with a common purpose that we need to solve this problem, we will find a solution.
Lisa.
Well, and just to jump in on this one, I think also at the table, and I agree we need a modernization of the municipal finance system, and part of that also involves the provincial and federal governments.
Absolutely.
And just, you know, when I heard your new president giving her remarks and the 4 topics that you focused on over the last few days, the opioid crisis, housing and homelessness, infrastructure, and economic development. When Canada was founded in 1867, maybe economic development maybe was the only one of those things that cities were working on. The financial situation and financial position of cities and the way that cities have been allowed to generate revenue literally hasn't changed since 1867, like almost, like maybe a little bit, but literally the only ways that municipalities can generate revenue is property taxes, services and fees, development cost charges, parking revenue. Like for all of the things that municipalities are asked to deliver, there is very little source of revenue. And so what we really need to have is a conversation with the provincial and federal governments about maybe it's 1% of PST that is generated in cities goes back to cities. Something like that, so that cities have some non-discretionary funding so they don't have to tax the housing. So anyway, it's a larger conversation than just housing, but we need to kind of modernize the financial system for municipalities in this country.
I think we saw at the Bear Pit session here, the Mayor of Burlington, Marianne Mead Ward, say this organization's 125 years old, and the way in which municipalities, their financial relationship with the province hasn't changed in 125 years. That shirt, you want to show us the shirt?
Yeah.
There you go.
Explain to the crowd.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, it absolutely should. You know, I bought my first home 20 years ago, and 20 years ago across the province, for a single detached home, development charges were about $5,000. They are now over $100,000. Let's fast forward 20 years from now when my kids are going to buy a home. You know, at this rate, development charges will be $2 million by 2044. And you're all laughing, oh, Mike, that's ridiculous. If I told you in 2004 that development charges would have been 6 figures, I would have been laughed out of this room. Right? So I think we need to re-examine these things. And I recognize that a lot of that, or almost all of that, can't be done by municipalities. But you know, I think we need to question our assumptions, right? We always talk about growth pays for growth, okay? But what is that growth in? A lot of that growth is in roads. Why don't cars pay for roads instead of houses pay for roads? Right? I think we need to look at that. Like why, if I'm living in a condo or an apartment in downtown Ottawa in a walkable community, why the heck am I getting charged all these development charges to build arterial roads out in the suburbs? Right? So not only is it expensive, but it's really not good for our climate. So instead, I think we need to better align, you know, the infrastructure we're building and the revenue source, right? That, you know, for water and wastewater, it should be water and wastewater use paying for that. For roads, it should be cars, rather than just dumping everything onto housing and then wondering, okay, well, why is our housing so expensive, right? Because we're making housing pay for absolutely everything. Even at times where, again, you're living in a walkable community downtown somewhere, but you're paying all of these development charges to build a bunch of roads, arterial roads that you'll never use. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, let's give some free advice to the people in this room, to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, to consumers, to everybody. If you want things to work better, go ahead, Neil. What do you want to see done?
Greater consistency across municipalities because our members operate in multiple jurisdictions. And they go to Grimsby or they go to Kincardine, very different processes. Their systems, their offices are set up kind of like a small manufacturer. They expect to have a very streamlined and consistent process. So Minister Calandra made a veiled comment about consistency and conformity that doesn't necessarily have to be done through legislation. I think he's looking to municipalities to make best efforts to do so, but I also got the impression that he wouldn't be afraid to do something if he's not seeing measurable progress.
I'm tempted to ask this audience whether you would be open to being legislated on that. Yeah, I'm seeing heads going like this in the front row. Yeah, okay, interesting.
But let me give you an example. Green development standards. There's about 26 municipalities who are in the process of doing green development standards. There is not one that is consistent.
There's 26 different standards.
Let's say there's not a high degree of consistency or conformity. Okay. We are not denying that green development standards play a significant role in the climate change and the climate crisis. And some of our builders are already doing it. They're going beyond the norm. And let's also remind ourselves that we have a brand new building code that has elevated the standards on energy efficiency, and effectively Ontario and BC are leading the way nationally on that. But imagine the frustration and added costs that it takes. And there are some municipalities who are withholding subdivision approval and site plan application because of some of these discretionary standards. So we want to have a conversation with the government. We want to have a conversation with municipalities about how can we create greater consistency. Because again, if we don't start a home, we're not getting closer to 1.5, right. 1.7, whatever the number is.
Gotcha. Lisa, some advice?
For these folks, these fine community serving folks in the room, well, I think, first of all, thank you for your service. I know it's really, really, really hard work. I was mayor of Victoria for 8 years, and through the pandemic, so really the challenging work that you all do. I guess my advice, and I was out the door as mayor and working in the Premier's office last year when all of these changes were happening, then I think have the political courage to make the decisions that are really, really difficult to make, even when sometimes small groups of people in your communities are very vocally opposed to those. So when I think that's one piece of advice. Really, and this one's really hard, but try and squint and look 50 years down the road and see what your community needs then, because that's ultimately your responsibility at the same time as taking care of your communities now, really looking 50 years down the road and setting the table for the future. And then the final thing, and this is complicated, but when I was Mayor of Victoria, I was also the co-chair of the BC Urban Mayors Caucus, which was 13 of us that represented 55% of BC's population. And we weren't all in agreement all the time, but one of the things that we were collectively, almost collectively, grateful for is when the province started to come out with some of these big moves, like getting rid of public hearings. Again, not everyone was in favor of that, but what that does for local governments is it gives you political cover. You can say, well, the province has mandated this and we have to build this housing, right? And so there's a tension there for sure, but if you can kind of lean into that and think about what that could mean to align yourself with, some big moves that the province might make, I think those are the things that I would say.
Jag, some advice for this audience?
Very similar to say, continue with a very strong collaboration. We're enjoying great collaboration with our peers at other levels of government, and we're exploring, opportunities to move quicker, whether that be with CMHC financing and looking at, we're discussing a portfolio approach at this point in time so that it's not quite as intensive as far as, looking at individual buildings and things of that sort. We're looking to streamline wherever possible. because the cost of delay, like we have one modular project in Toronto that got delayed for 2 years as a result of hearings. The cost more than doubled for what was intended to be there, and of course there's substantial community feedback around it as well. And so all of the, I guess from a process perspective, the funding perspectives, we need to find ways to streamline and accelerate, because as we do, we'll be able to deliver housing much faster.
Last word to Mike Moffat.
Oh, well, thank you. So, I would concur. We need to have more as of right, more sort of upzoning. I know that's difficult, but there's no way to get to 1.5 without it. I'm going to channel my inner JMM. The one thing that we haven't talked about is building code. There's no solution here that doesn't involve building a lot of apartments, and right now the building code makes it very difficult to build family-sized units, like 3 bedrooms plus. So that's a lot of stairway reform, elevator reform, a variety of reforms that are difficult. There are stakeholders who will challenge that with some very real concerns, particularly firefighters. But I think we need to work with them, figure out how to fix that building code, because even if we hit 1.5 million units, if we're getting there by building a bunch of studio condos and nothing else, we're still going to have a housing crisis.
Gotcha. Well, let me just say a couple of things in wrapping up. I know that you all want to join me in thanking these 4 from coming very near and very far for today's discussion. Thank you very much, everybody, and it's great to be with you again here at AMO in Ottawa. And that is the agenda for Thursday, September 19th, 2024. Tomorrow, join us for On Pauly, where John Michael McGrath and yours truly talk the by-election in Bay of Quinte and the state of the province's books. We hope you'll be with us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Pauly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.